at the time. I had no idea at the time that there would be a second part. So, but sometime when one works on something, that something starts to work on you. And I think that I feel that this is what happened. So I'm really glad that we can share that second half. So we met a year ago at the solstice time. It was actually exactly the day of the solstice, 2024, which was perfect because the intention and what we did was focus on that special time of the year, which encompasses the solstice, Christmas, and New Year's Eve. And what they all have in common is the celebration of the end of a cycle and the beginning of a new cycle. So here we're looking at the cycle of the year. And the cycle of the year is the cycle actually of the time body of the earth. It's really the time the time body of our earthly being that is involved in that. And what that is that time body is composed. I'm using on purpose this musical word because it's composed of the relationship between the earth, the sun, and the moon, which we see with the movement and one of the edges of that movement at the time of the winter solstice, which is that the sun is at the lowest point in its cycle and is going to begin to ascend. And that corresponds to a new cycle of vegetation. So the earth starts to come to a new life. So that so it's a pause. We're celebrating a pause there that lasts from solstice to forest, the 12 holy nights. So this is a 12, a day and night pause. And that pause, so I said, is a phase. It's really a phase in the cycle of the earth. And we find in the cycle of every form of being. So it's that phase that corresponds to the end before a new beginning. But the inner being of phase doesn't really describe the reality of that pause, because that pause, in fact, is a hub. And it's a hub of transition between manifestation and withdrawal from manifestation. Is the in and out of manifestation that happens through that mysterious place and time that is common to all forms of being, which is quite extraordinary when we think of that. It's a common source because there's one source of being. So the return to being goes through that universal threshold, and we know this threshold because that for us, in its vastest sense, is the threshold of birth and the threshold of death. It's reflected in our breath cycle. It's reflected in our heartbeat. And it's always that mysterious place where the heart stops before it begins to beat again. And the breath, the exhaling, goes through a pause before this mysterious healing out of nowhere that we go through all the time. So that's where we were focused. So the essence was this rebirth of a time cycle, the rebirth of time. So this is what led us to archetypally look at the primeval happening of this rebirth of time, which is the birth of time that Steiner describes in the inner realities of evolution and in the description of the old Saturn phase. So in old Saturn, he describes how time is born out of the sacrifice of the thrones to the cherubim. And it's out of that union of what is given by the throne and what is received by the cherubim that the spirits of time are born, that time is born. And he says time is independent being, which is a really intriguing statements that makes us return to that notion of the time being, like the time being of the earth. We all have this quasi-independent independence through our time being. It's quasi because it's an open system. We're not enclosed, but we are relatively enclosed. So independent being, the birth of time. So then he goes on to describe the old sun. And with the old sun, we see a parallel enactment or reenactment of a sacrificial deed. This time is with the spirits of wisdom who are contemplating what happened on Saturn and are so awed and blissed by this contemplation of that sacrifice that they are moved to radiate their own being. And radiating their own being is later received by the archangel. And out of that, again, union or interchange of giving and receiving, the sphere of the sun is born. Space is born, light is born. So we have a very similar picture, central picture. So then he says, imagine these deeds absorbed, received in the soul of one being, this being the Christ. And that is what is coming into the earth through the incarnation. So a really very majestic picture, like really condensed. And he condenses that by bringing into the center of his picture of evolution, the painting by Leonardo, The Last Supper, a painting. So I'm going to bring that up, share my screen here. Oh, I think you need to turn
Try again. I just made you co-host because you dropped out and I didn't make you co-host.
Shame on me. Yeah, okay.
All right, so we're all set now.
Yeah. Okay, I think it's working. Okay. So here is the picture. So it's interesting having that in the background. So this is where we're going to begin the second part. But it begins with that picture, which actually ended the first talk. So in that picture, now that we have what we have in the background, we can almost perceive in that perspective that Leonardo brings the spiritual perspective of that first sacrifice and that second sacrifice. Here we have that third image of a sacrifice, the sacrifice by the Christ. And Steiner makes this striking pronouncement also that this painting, if anyone came from Mars, he says, they could, in viewing this painting, intuit the mission of the earth. So it certainly alerts us to the significance of this for the future. So we see the past and we have already an intimation of the future through that notion of the mission of the earth. So we could say also that this is a picture that corresponds to the turning point of time. So the rebirth of the birth of time and the turning point of time have the same tenor. There is something striking about that too. So the central picture is the central reality of this picture is communion. And I don't know if I use the word communion because this is not a word that Steiner uses when he speaks of the throne, the gift of the throne to the cherubim. And yet that's what's happening. I spoke of the union. So communion is coming all the way through, and communion is really our fundamental theme tonight. So the mystery of communion that Steiner places at the center here of the evolutionary picture, for us anthroposophists calls to mind the new form of communion that he spoke about very early on in his life. Actually, it was 1884, so he was only 23. And he spoke about this new form of communion that he referred to as a spiritual communion in thinking. A spiritual communion in thinking. And he referred to it as the true communion of humanity. Thinking, he said, is the true communion of humanity. So I'm just going to check my phone here. So here is what he says in 1884. By taking possession of the idea, thinking merges with the source of the world's existence. That which works outside enters into the human spirit. It becomes one with objective reality at its highest potency. Becoming aware of the idea in reality is the true communion of man. In 1886, he further explains that by understanding the world through thinking, we reunite that which initially comes to have separated into mind and matter. Then in 1916, when we endeavor to bring what we call our knowledge into our consciousness in such a way that as our souls are filled with ideas of the spiritual world, we are aware that the spiritual world is entering into us and that we are being united with the spiritual. When we look upon that as a communion, then the symbolic sacrament of the altar will become the universal sacramental experience of knowledge. And one more quote, and I want to bring attention to the two movements that are engaged in everything that he says. A movement inward from the world inward and from the self outward into the world. The thinking concerned with the stream of world events draws me and my soul into itself. I am living in those events when I allow their essence to flow into me through my thinking. So we see the two complementary movements at work in this reunion process of world and self at work in thinking. Now, for thinking to raise itself to this quality of communing, it must be charged and warmed with hot forces. And Steiner mentioned awe, reverence, devotion, surrender, all the qualities that we really saw portrayed in those great pictures of the beginning of the universe. Only when our thinking activity has this dimension of devotional surrendering to the spirit world can the spirit world reveal itself to us. So what Steiner reveals here for us to become aware of is the sacramental character of thinking. Thinking as an act of communion of human subjectivity and cosmic being. And this, I believe, is really a new step in the human consciousness, what is revealing here. I may be wrong, but I think it is. So this resonates with the second panel of the Foundation Stone Meditation, Thine Own Eye Unite with the World Eye, which is precisely the panel of the Christ consciousness as communion. Now, it's only 40 years after he first spoke about this 40 years later in 1922, that Steiner will ground this fundamental principle of thinking. Because I think it becomes a principle. It makes thinking into a principle, that it will ground that into an actual ritual practice, which he referred to as the cosmic ritual. So this is how he describes the two forms of communion. In the first form of communion, we allow our entire earthly being to be poured into union with the supersensible. In the second form of communion, the human being pours into the earth the supersensible he has within himself. He inserts soul and spirit into the mineral and vegetable he takes in as nourishment. And now this is 1922, and that's the night when he gave that lecture about the cosmic ritual. Spiritual knowledge is thus a veritable communion, the beginning of a cosmic ritual that is right and fitting for the human being of today, who begins to realize how, as he quickens the spirit in himself, he charms it. I think it's an interesting translation. He charms it also into the dead and dying matter that surrounds him. So we see how the new communion complements and mirrors the first, the Christian communion, in that the gesture is reversed from the receiving gesture by the earth and the human beings absorbing a Christed, sun transubstantiated substance to humans pouring their soul spirit into nature and cosmos. So both forms of communion involve the transmutation of food substance into flesh and blood, in one case into the flesh and blood of the solar logos, this is my body, this is my blood, and in the second case, the flesh and blood of a human being. The first communion is initiated from above by the Christ, and the second communion is initiated from below by a human initiate, and it is to be enacted by human beings out of our own forces of will, thinking, and feeling. So when we pour our supersensible being, meaning our astral self, our I being, our soul light, our spirit warmth, out of love for the earth in the transmutation of the mineral and vegetable nature that we have received from the gods, we bring matter to commune with spirit within our soul. So we unsold what is otherwise a purely cosmic process of digestion and transubstantiation of nature into human organism. We unsold the becoming of matter. Our part in the world, Steiner says, is to imbue the intelligent processes of the cosmos with the soulful love forces awakened in the human self by the Christ. Quote, we must be conscious that we as human beings, by a deliberate loving act of human will, transform that which has become matter, the earthly substance formed by the being of the stars, the watery substance powered by the deeds of the planetary movements, back again into spirit. In this manner, we perform a real act of transubstantiation. We become aware of our own part in the world, which is resonating with the mission of the earth theme, underlying that caption for Leonardo's painting. So the second communion revealed the soul essence of the turning point of time and evolution, which is a reversal of consciousness, from receiving from the God to giving ourselves to the God by pouring ourselves into nature. And this reversal in consciousness, Steiner says, is critical for the earth itself to not perish, for the earth to have a future. And he explained, quote, the earth ego and astral body, meaning the ego and the astral body of the earth, surround the earth with soul and spirit, but they do not permeate a mineral and vegetable activities. The mineral nature of the earth, as observed by us, shows itself unable to let soul and spirit enter into it, and able only to let them surround it with light. So Steiner makes us realize, end of quote, that while spirit and the Godhead we know pervade everything in nature, this world of nature left to itself would perish. It has no future. And it behooves human beings, he says, quote, to give something to nature that nature itself does not have. Active thoughts, perception, and attentiveness enlivened with heart forces. Attentiveness enlivened with heart forces. And this is what we receive with the mantric verses that he gave on the night of December 31st, 1922, New Year's Eve, to accompany this cosmic ritual that he introduced as a sacramental practice, a practice to insert the light of our spiritual knowing thinking, because we have to know something in order to practice that. So the light of our spiritual knowing and the warmth of our spiritual feeling, heart egoic forces in the transubstantiation of nature in our beings. So I'll first read his accompanying comment so that we can enter the verses with more awareness. So this is what he says. When we look at some structure of the earth that we are about to take into ourselves as food, we are looking at an image of the constellations of the fixed stars. When we take that substance into ourselves, we take in an earth activity, an activity that contains the beings of the stars. When we take in watery life to permeate the fluid part of our organism, the circulation of the blood and juices, we take in a copy of the movements of the planets. So as we take this consciously as a ritual act in our love-permeated will, we transform what has become matter back into spirit again. So now the verses. As I'm drinking, that's a coincidence. In earth activity draws near to me, given to me in substance imaged form, the heavenly being of the stars. In willing, I see them transformed with love. In watery life stream into me, forming me through with power of substance force, the heavenly deeds of the stars, the deeds of the planetary movements. In feeling, I see them transformed with wisdom. So this sacramental practice is literally about imbuing the nature we take in with soul forces of loving will and wise feeling. And this pouring of our soul ego being into the forms and processes of nature is, Steiner says, our part in the world. So the creation of stars and planetary rhythms, everything in nature, all its forms and processes speak to the work of the Father. And this work is complete in itself. It makes us realize. And it depends on us human beings to take nature, to charm nature, quote, onward, to charm it onward with our soul forces, so that it can be part of the evolving soul of creation. In other words, our task is to be a Christing bridge for nature. The Christ was the bridge for humankind to begin to commune with the spirit world. And now it behooves us to be the bridge for the spiritualizing of nature. It's interesting, I find, to ponder the fact that the Christ transmuted bread and wine, which are products of nature that have already been transformed and fermented. I don't know if that's the exact process, but one could say partially etherized by time and human intelligence. Whereas we human beings, according to Steiner's ritual, are to transform earthly matters and waters, in other words, raw nature. As if our physicality is investing us with both the privilege and the responsibility to commune with the very matter and of spirit, to turn the waters into living waters and earth activities into ego-pervaded substance. So to commune with the nature we take in by pouring loving will into its form and forces is the beginning of the reverse ritual. So whereas the traditional Christian ritual ends with communion following transubstantiation, which was preceded by offering and revelation, the reading of the gospel, the reverse ritual begins with communion, communion with matter and matters. Again, thine own I unite with the world I, leading to transubstantiation, then offering and revelation. This is just a brief allusion to those steps, the literal reversing of the steps. So this cosmic ritual that Steiner introduces of pouring ourselves into nature is essentially of a sacrificial character. And it mirrors on a very small scale the sacrifice of the gods and the sacrifice of the Christ. And this is the turning point it marks in the evolution of consciousness. Quote, the knowing human being, this may be this is the central pronouncement, really, that we want to take in. The knowing human being, summoning up powers of will and feeling, becomes a sacrificing being. That's the reversal of consciousness. And both forms of communion are set in a dramatic context of sacrifice. We're very familiar with the dramatic background of the Last Supper. And Steiner's new ritual of communion is also introduced in a dramatic setting, which is the burning of the Goetheanum. He inaugurates this ritual in the course of the lecture he gives on the evening of the fire, which is the last evening lecture, which is why I refer to it as the Last Supper lecture, to take place in the Goetheanum before it went into flame. So when we read the lecture with the hindsight awareness of its momentous background, it's striking to note the resonances between the theme, some of the words of fire and combustion that are spoken inside the Goetheanum, and the actual blaze that is about to erupt outside. Combustion has been a theme, somewhat implicitly when he's referring to the digestive process involved or implied in that taking in of nature, but quite directly in his description of the interaction of the ego astral with the physical etheric that goes on in the human being while he is awake. And he describes it as, quote, gleaming above them like a flame, the mineral and vegetable portions are seen to be withering and collapsing, while the ego and astral body gleam down into them and as it were, burn them up. This is walking man with the mineral matter crumbling within him. All through the fading substance, big and little flames are gleaming and glowing. Almost a literal description of the physical fire that is about to erupt. So it's quite an extraordinary synchronicity. You know, the definition of synchronicity is a meaningful coincidence. And I think we all love synchronicity because they have a magical way to, in an uncanny way, bring to us from the outside something that is in complete resonance with something going on within us. You know, a thought, an idea, the thought of a person, a theme, a question, and all of a sudden something comes completely out of the blue and is in union with what's going on within. And that's the meaningfulness of it, is that it has this mysterious hint to a dimension that transcends the mind, because our mind operates in a dual way. Here is my subject, here is the object. And here, all of a sudden, subject and object are one. So it gives us a powerful inkling of a higher dimension of reality, where the distinction between the inside and the outside no longer exists or is transcended. So with regard to the fire, the synchronicity points to a transcendent spiritual fire. This is, my own thought that I submit to your own resonance or not. But it points to a transcendent spiritual fire originating beyond the mind's distinction between the words spoken inside the Goetheanum and the external fire. One could say a supersensible fire that would manifest itself simultaneously in these two sides of the human experience. So we might realize that we are looking at the inner side and the external side of one reality. And supporting this is a remark that Steiner made a year later, quote, "The forms of the columns and the architrave in the Goetheanum spoke a language that was a continuation of the language spoken in words from the platform. The sound of the words flowed on into the plastically molded forms." So we can imagine the flaming words flowing and glowing into the columns. They were predisposed to convey this language of fire that became quite literal. So we begin to read the lecture as a whole as the esoteric script of the fire. Now, 4 months later, Steiner will speak of the, quote, "process of combustion" as the material process for the unfolding of the human will. Processes, he says, as that in which the flame consumes the candle substance, occur wherever initiatives of will are astir within us. In the generating of combustion in our organism, we can behold the creative power of the cosmic will at work. So what this suggests to us is the presence of a cosmic will hovering above the scene and wielding the firebrand. Quote, "At the very moment when the Goetheanum was ready to become the bearer of the renewal of spiritual life, in that very moment was flung into it the burning brand." So in essence, the fire, the supersensible cosmic fire, was already engaged in the new ritual of spiritual communion that Steiner introduced that night. And from the perspective of its ritual dimension, we can say that the burning Goetheanum would become indeed and in fact the bearer of the renewal of spiritual life. So we might ask, what cosmic will was at work in the matter that was beginning to burn, collapse, and crumble as the Goetheanum was set in fire? What the larger context of the lecture and fire drama, placing that as one reality, leads us to understand is that what was at work behind this dual event is the sacrificial will of an initiate, surrendering to a greater universal will, a will to consume and transubstantiate the materiality of the Goetheanum in a communion of spirit matter, akin to the ritual cult that he was precisely introducing at the human level and consecrating it. So two rituals. So Steiner's assistant, no, actually she's referred to as a colleague, Anne Sam Weber, she wrote this little book called Narrative. I have it in French, so I don't remember the title in English, but her memories of Steiner. She had some clairvoyant abilities, and she later described her experience that as the cupola of the Goetheanum collapsed amidst powerful flame, a new temple could already be seen arising from the sacrificial fire. She saw the building, now this is her quote, saw the building very high above the flames of a luminous whiteness. And it was for me a certitude, something grandiose is happening. End of quote. So the temple built from below, out of Steiner's soul spiritual forces, was being dematerialized into its spiritual essence. And this essence would take on a new form a year later in a subtle anthroposophical edifice, one could say, anchored in human hearts through the foundation stone meditation. Now, with regard to this greater cosmic will behind the burning brand, I want to read a quote that illumines that question, and by the same token, the synchronicity of event on the night of the fire, and I think synchronicities in general, which a lot of people have been struggling to define, including Jung. So that's an important statement. Quote, thought is not merely something which the human being cultivates in himself as a human force of the soul, but also something which, quite independently of him and his soul, bears within itself some being of a cosmic nature, a being to whom he must work his way if he intends to live in something which belongs at the same time to him and to the world that is independent of him. To live in something which belongs at the same time to him and to the world that is independent of him. So here we see the synchronicity. So he really gives us the secret of what we experience as synchronicity of within and without. That's something that originates itself in the will of the cosmic being in whom we have our being, that universal beingness in us that transcends the separation between subjective and objective. And this is what Jung called the self. So here is it's a very resonating idea, but that really is much more defining. And we also hear again in a different form the fundamental principle that Steiner illumined and that we considered earlier of thinking as the reunion of self and world, thinking as spiritual communion. So now these are the solemn words with which Steiner introduced the cosmic ritual during the lecture. And I placed them on purpose in what proved to be the actual and vaster context of the burning Goetheanum, because they capture the sacrificial and sacramental tenor, not only of the ritual he has just inaugurated, but of the initiatory sacrifice that he is entering. And they resonate with the idea of the cosmic will that we were just pondering. Quote, surrendering himself to the supreme direction of the universe. We can hear another word for supreme will, supreme self of the universe, that is all around him. He can carry out in living consciousness the act of transubstantiation in the great temple of the cosmos, standing within it as one who is celebrating a sacrifice in a purely spiritual way. So if we let these last words expand beyond the platform of the lecture, where he's pronouncing them, to spread above the building that is engulfed in flame, it's really deeply moving in a new and different way to see Steiner's silhouette surrendered, at once desolate, certainly, and radiant, according to Anselm Weber. surrender to the supreme direction of the universe. As a transubstantiation is carried out of the material temple, he has poured all his life forces and insight into an immaterial, supersensible one. It's almost as a nuclear picture of the ritual that he's initiating us into. When we refer to the Goetheanum fire, we think primarily of the arson and of its motivation. And yet the reality that looms larger when we let the whole context speak is of an initiatory sacrifice. Now, the word sacrifice tends to imply a conscious decision to proceed through a challenging act. But if we think of it, it's really one's response to a challenging event beyond one's control that gives an experience the quality of a sacrifice or not. So to what degree Steiner might have known in advance about what was to happen, although important, interesting, is in the end irrelevant to its sacrificial character. No matter the degree of advanced knowing, sacrifice is only known when it is undergone. And I think that includes the Jesus sacrifice. Yes. So nonetheless, it's interesting to know that in her memoir, Anne Sam Weber recounts sharing with Steiner a few months earlier the vision she had that, quote, the Goetheanum would burn down in the coming months. In fact, she feared she might never experience the Goetheanum if she didn't find a way to join the end of the year's gathering, which was going to be the Christmas conference. And she managed to be present on the night of the fire, even though the financial hurdle seemed insurmountable initially. And Steiner and Mary Steiner, really tried to reconcile her with not going, but she went. And she later described how in a moment of clairvoyant sight, she saw the building and then the builder sublimated in luminous whiteness. Quote, as I looked to the other side, she recounts, I saw Rudolf Steiner crowned with a gigantic aura of white light, and I knew something is taking place between the doctor and the burning building. It seems clear that for Steiner, the inner event was a major initiatory step in universal communion. And just as a possible indication for what I'm suggesting here, and that's not from Steiner source, from theosophical sources that offer a lot of context for the process of evolution, and if we go from initiation to initiation. The initiation that Jesus, that's why I, spoke about Jesus going through the crucifixion rather than the Christ, Jesus Christ. So according to those sources, the initiation that Jesus went through what is referred to as the initiation of crucifixion. And it is the fourth, according to a certain structure of initiation. The major initiation that is beyond most of humanity, beyond most of us, is the third initiation. And that's the major, really, initiation. It's called the initiation of transfiguration, according to this theosophical naming and referring to the steps. So I'm just mentioning where I'm coming from to suggest that. So the experience for Steiner was, in his own words, devastating and unutterably painful, like a form of death, like a death, he said to Ita Wigman. He said that he actually died. I'm quoting, compared to other people, as I am as if already dead. My eye and astral body direct the physical body and supplement the etheric. And friends noted, the loss of vitality. They would describe, he used to have this very springly gait, very rhythmical, vital. And there was a certain flattening, a certain collapsing of those forces. And his forces started to decline. So when we follow the development of the following year, 1923, we can imagine, imagine an initiatory arc taking him from the death-like experience to the resurrecting impulse of the Christmas conference. So in this light, the sacrificial consuming of the Goetheanum was not only the origin in time of the refounding of the Anthroposophical Society a year later, but it was its sacramental ground. So beyond the chronological unfolding, what we are really looking at here is an initiatory path and deed of Steiner. And I think it's of great significance to widen our perspective on the fire beyond the immediate sight of the arson, to contemplate its dimension as a sacrificial deed, because it allows us to see the spiritual ground of the refounded society, not so much or not only in the ashes of the Goetheanum, but in the essence of the event, which is the cosmic ritual that Steiner inaugurated that night and which was consecrated, one could say, and inscribed in the body of evolution as only a sacrificial act can by his own spiritual trial or ritual of communion, transubstantiation, offering. I mean, we see those phases in his and the revelation to come, a year later. So what emerges is that the cosmic ritual, the reversed ritual of sacrificial communion, is the core impulse in what Steiner hoped would be, quote, an earthly sanctuary for the refounding of the mysteries. So instead of a logical, horizontal cause and effect sequence of event, from the tragic burning of a building to its recreation on settled grounds, we realize the more essential vertical dimension of the journey of 1923 from fire to the Christmas conference as an event of initiatory raising or upliftment from one octave of consciousness to the next, and occurring on two levels at the same time, one for us and one for Steiner. So for the Steiner students we are, a cosmic ritual is initiated or initiates a reorientation and reversal of consciousness in practice from knowledge to sacrifice. That's really the core meaning for us. And for Steiner, on a higher, much higher ground, much more universal ground of consciousness, a sacrificial ritual of initiation took place, which served as a consecrating deed for the ritual he had just initiated. And the parallel with the Christ is really interesting and striking, it seems to me, in that we see the same sequence of a Last Supper ritual of communion consecrated by a sacrificial deed, the crucifixion for Jesus the Christ, and the New Year's Eve consuming fire for Steiner. And the Christ words come to mind here. I, when I be lifted up, will draw all men into me. This resonates really with the envisioning of the raising mission of Steiner's sacrificial trial and deed. And I would say, anticipating almost like the last quote, one of the last quote I will bring, it's a raising mission for our world. So for that to come later. So we know, as Steiner spoke to this, that the refounding of the society was a sacrificial act. So yeah, we sort of know that because he said he united himself with the karma of the society. Mary Steiner referred to it as an unparalleled act of sacrifice. But primarily, she put it in the context of, actually, I'm quoting a spiritual atonement, or I'm saying in the sense of a spiritual atonement of sin, because she referred to the insufficiencies of the anthroposophical society at the time. However, unless we understand this karmic sacrifice in the larger context of the sacramental burning of the Goetheanum as a cosmic ritual, this karmic sacrifice as a cosmic ritual, the notion of a karmic sacrifice remains pretty abstract. At least I've experienced it as an abstract idea. And it lacks the magnitude and the depth of meaning that comes from realizing the initiatory sacrifice behind it, which is obviously not something that Steiner or any true initiate would point to, obviously. So it behooves us maybe to realize it. So the idea that the cosmic reverse ritual is the core impulse of the new anthroposophical edifice was actually affirmed by Steiner himself that very night of the fire, a year before the Christmas conference. This is what he said: if anthroposophy is to fulfill its mission in the world, the human being's whole relationship to the world must be recognized to be one of cosmic ritual. It must rise from knowledge to cosmic ritual. What would otherwise be mere abstract knowledge achieves a relationship of will and feeling to the world. And here again, this statement: the knowing human being, summoning up powers of will and feeling, becomes a sacrificing being. End of quote. So the words, it must rise from knowledge to cosmic ritual, speak to what we were just contemplating here as the lifting up or raising character of the whole event. This is what Steiner is accomplishing, and this is what we are called to do again on a lesser octave of consciousness. So the reverse communion ritual lights up the other side, the human side of the Last Supper table, the human counter-gift to the divine gift of creation. And as the first act of communion was central to the first turning point of time, Steiner's sacrificial communion is central to what he referred to as the new turning point of time, which was the Christmas conference act. So we now see through that centering lens of the Last Supper painting how Steiner's cosmic ritual mirrors the Christ sacrificial communion from the earthly side of the table, and how through this image and imagination, it resonates with the primordial sacrifice of world creation. So the flow of sacrifice that poured from the throne to the Spirit of wisdom, then to the Christ into the physical earth, reverses its course in the human consciousness when humans begin to take hold of the self-giving impulse at the core of selfhood, so that humankind begins to resonate with the great sacrifice of creation. So we now see two facets and two steps, one divine and one human, to the turning point of time, and a dual ritual of communion. By placing Leonardo's Last Supper painting at the hub of evolution, as an illustration of the mission of the earth, Steiner gives us to see how the same scene of sacrificial communion that marks the turning point of evolution, because this is where he places it, speaks also to the primeval beginnings of time and to the farthest ends of the earth as mission of the earth. So the entire evolution from primeval past to distant future converges and condenses around that table of communion, of spirit with matter, of matter with spirit, of gods and human, of humans and gods. So the entire process of involution and evolution is held in this dual gesture of giving, receiving, which is the gesture, the dynamic gesture of the heart that we pondered in the first part of this talk. So we can say that communing is the living heart of evolution and the timeless content of time. Communing is at once being separate and one, separate enough to experience becoming one by surrendering. So to close, I would like to place the entire picture back in Rudolf Steiner's hands, in the context of his own words, in a lecture that he gave very early on, almost 20 years earlier, and which illumines the events that were to come. So this is from a lecture of 1907, the Lord's Prayer, where he spoke about what he called the great sacrifice. The central goal of existence is known to spiritual science as the great sacrifice, signifying the power of will to sacrifice oneself completely, not merely in driblets of human sacrifice of the kind of which man is capable today with his puny present feelings and willpower. In future time, he will have developed the strength to sacrifice his whole being by letting it flow directly into material substance. When the will has become capable of making the great sacrifice, this is really a key sentence, it actually creates a universe, great or small, whose mission is bestowed upon it by its creator. Such is the creative will in the divine being. That's an extraordinary, very revelatory statement. We recognize the sacrificial character of the creative will of the gods that gave birth to our universe. But similar to how the throne's great sacrifice gave birth to our universe in time and space, and similar to how the sacrifice of the Christ rebirthed the planet Earth into the beginnings of a solarized radiant star, in the same way we can say that the refounded Anthroposophical Society is a new universe, a re-ensouled universe born of Steiner's sacrifice. What suggests itself from the whole context is that Steiner's deed is a creative initiatory act, only secondarily related to the difficulty of the society, in a way similar to how the mission of the Christ had an evolutionary necessity and regenerative character that far transcended the redemption of sins, at least as we conceive of that. So Steiner's own words invite us to see in his Christmas Act conference the creation of a spiritualized human sphere, a re-spirited, rehumanized universe, maybe the very Christosphere that Teilhard de Chardin talked about and foresaw. Thank you for listening. Thank you for receiving.
Wow, amazing.
I'm going to stop my
Stop
sharing.
share. There we
And we
go.
can converse.
Oh, wow. What a
So it's time for our Q&A, and
conversation, maybe.
we're a small enough group that you don't have to raise your hand, but if there's any questions that people have, I'll just start. Monique, I was very impressed how you brought the fire and the synchronicity in, and in part because, as some of you know, I've been working on something called refined breathing, what Steiner brought, and trying to understand it. And in it, he used the word combustion. The combustion is going on inside the human being all the time. We are essentially burning carbon and making carbon dioxide. And that this then finds its way as an excrement out of us through our exhalation. Um, and I, in historical perspective, um, humans used to sacrifice by burning the sacrifice. It was a burnt offering. And when Cain and Abel did that, Abel's was not accepted, which is interesting. His didn't rise up to the level of Yahweh. It stayed sort of on surrounding the earth. And in that series, The Inner Realities of Evolution, Steiner does mention something about this rejection in the now I forget if it's the old sun or the old moon period,
Moon,
where
your moon.
old moon, yeah, where
Yeah.
the higher beings cannot accept the rejection, cannot the sacrifice, the burnt offering, because if they accept it, they have to take it into their being. So something has changed in the spiritual world as well, I would say, for now the human sacrifice to be a communion with the spiritual world. The spiritual world is not different than it was back in old moon time.
Mm.
I would just offer that. There's something else, fire mist. It's a term Steiner uses, and it's a very interesting thing. Water puts out fire, you know, but he said that humanity will find a way to make this fire mist a combination of water and fire, of maybe the eye and the etheric body. Yeah, I don't know if you any just you don't have to comment on it. I'm just putting it out there as something that I was inspired from your talk to share. So,
Thank you.
any questions or other thoughts from anyone? Irene, it looked like you were about to say something and then held back.
Well, it was, thank you, Monique. Thank you so much. It was so deep that you saw it on my face. I cannot hide it. I'm completely in that. And I'm just digesting so many connections, and that coming back to that activity of knowing, that activity of thinking that is permeated by our will and our feeling, how that activity, with that activity, we're Christianizing the mineral and the plant part of the earth.
Yeah.
Yeah, the way you put it.
Yeah, the way
Yeah.
said yes.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for your resonance, Irene, because that was the tender of my feeling in sort of this journey, because I didn't know. I think I told you I didn't know there would be a second part. So it was, and it has really changed a lot of my, I don't know, perception, understanding suddenly of the fire, of what Steiner went through. So yeah, it felt pretty momentous to come to that, and that whole perspective of involution and evolution, and how that it can condense itself in that notion of communing. It's quite striking. And that's the painting he used. He placed that at the center. So something really quite significant there. Yeah.
You know, when you think of thinking as a type of burning, I mean, it is a type of burning. And you think, or one might think of the burning of the Goetheanum and as a kind of the thinking as a transcendent function that actually puts together the inner and the outer aspect of the universe.
Exactly.
So, but not abstract thinking, but thinking with love. And love really is the transcendent function that puts this all together and makes it not separate, but a true communion.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's what that sentence where he speaks about thought as that and the cosmic will, I found stunning. Yeah. So clear.
Thank you for your wonderful clarification of this and pointing this out, this tremendous act of sacrifice. I mean, um, um, to bring us to this true communion.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's so easy to, view this grand initiate. And that's where I think theosophy is helpful because, you see more a path, and there's some beings that don't incarnate anymore. When we incarnate, we still, have something to process on earth. So I could say to allow oneself, to allow myself, to even frame it in that context of the initiation of crucifixion. And that's why I didn't know how everyone would respond because it seems to frame something that we tend to leave as unframeable, but it is frameable.
Mhm.
Yeah.
At least perhaps we're working towards it. Thank you for moving us towards that.
Yeah, well, that's the beauty of Steiner that he concentrates on humanity and the Christ. And I think it's well complemented by the theosophical picture, which has a very different tenor, but brings a lot of elements that make everything relate more proportionately to each other.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Pam.
Thank you.
There was a Peter Seld talk not long ago where he was talking about Ita Wegman, and apparently this happened while they were in England, if I'm not mistaken, and it's because of a question that she asked that the Christmas conference was able to come about. And exactly her words in the question I couldn't tell you, but it was something about this what anthroposophy had been, and if there's something new now.
Mm.
So anyway, I thought that Peter did a
Yeah,
good job
yeah.
with that series. So
Yeah, I listened to one of them. But that's such an interesting contemplation, really, is how uncharted all this is. So, like when you're saying, it's like the questions seem to have been critical. Same thing with the question from Mary Steiner that moved Steiner on the direction of anthroposophy, where he would extract himself from the Eastern theosophy. And yet the person has their mission, but they still, I don't know if it's depend, but yeah, there is an engagement that is there all the way with other beings. It's not like even the Christ arrives with his mission, but it's not independent of human beings to participate along the way, including Judas.
It's, he says, Steiner talks about how after the turning point in time, I mean, before that, we had to accept the mysteries and it was inappropriate to ask questions. But since then, it is essential that we ask questions because when you think of it, to ask a question is to engage the will. And the path forward for us now is one where we must intend it, we must will it. It's not just going to be given to us. So nothing happens without our questioning. That is essential
Interesting.
for us to be doing that.
Mm. That's
And
good
when
to
you
hear.
look at the continued reincarnation of these two figures, and in each incarnation, how they related to each other, what they gave to each other, Ita Wegman and Rudolf Steiner, and how they played, to raise each other, that what they were contributing to humanity at that time, how they raised it through these questions. And certainly that is the human task, isn't it, to meet in community, um, in love, of course, for the support. He never, he never says, we've given you the consciousness soul situation just so that you can raise yourself all by yourself as an individual. That's not what it's all about. It's really how we work, yeah, with each other. That's the essence.
I think that keeps us in balance, doesn't it? I mean, if we went by ourselves, we'd end up with Lucifer and black magicians, in a completely encased egotism. But because we are with others, we really keep each other safe from those excesses. I mean, I really think that's true. It's the safe path is to do it with others. Because no one of us could ever, truly take in all of Christ, but together, we all get a piece of it.
And all our becoming is relational.
Yes.
We don't become outside of
No.
relationship.
No.
Everything is relational.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. We always had this vision of this Christ in the center and surrounded by this completely reflective sphere. And every human being has a point on that sphere
Mm.
and can reflect it back, but only together can we reflect the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
And we come back to Andrew's verse at the beginning.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's why I thought it was so interesting. I just stopped in the middle because there was this arc there, or this reciprocity, or this, double vortex, really.
Mm-hmm. But your essence was how, at least the essence, or I don't really have a full grasp of it, was the universe, its gift to us, and now how we have to give this other gift back, to the earth, and that's through this. I know that thinking, and this heartfelt thinking, is essential in it, but it seemed to me that it was you. I felt like you used this word of, this concept of transforming the food, transforming the gifts that the earth gives us in nourishment, and of course, we use the minerals in certain ways as well, in our diet, of course, but somehow we have to transform that so that, yeah, so that the earth can continue, I guess, its existence. And I just don't know if is it purely, physical nourishment? I know it's not, but I'm not clear exactly how it relates to physical nourishment. I don't think it.
Yeah, well, I think it's very not obvious to us because this is the most remote for us. I mean, this is the level of spirit man, when spirit will really penetrate into physical. So we cannot know that. Now we know spirit self. We know that we're working on our astral. We have a pretty, clear sense of that. But that working on the physical is really way into the future. Nonetheless, that gesture must begin. So, and we also don't realize the reality of our thinking and our feeling and how it flows into things. I mean, that's something I became aware through biogeometry because I can measure it, and it strikes me each time. But this is a fact, I think I mentioned crossing a bread, used to be an ancient practice, and you think, oh, that's nice, religious people do that. When you look, it actually vivifies the bread. The bread emits life. So those are facts, but they're not, they're beyond our science or our current science, and they're certainly beyond our experience. So that's why it's a practice, and it's a practice of this pretty selfless. I mean, if you give yourself to the food, it's not something that returns to you in any way. But what I had to sort of understand for myself was that passage. It's not symmetrical, this return to the source, because we are returning with, a unique self-awareness. That's not where we begin. So what happens into nature is not what the creating God did. It's what the Christ brought in us that now we are transferring into the earth. And that's why I insisted on the word ensouling. We're really bringing astrality and egoity into nature. We're not giving it, again, digestion goes on very well without us, and we don't have to think about it. But what we're bringing is the element of thought and feeling, that loving attentiveness. And I think he speaks about thinking, but I think it's true. I mean, Andrew with Mystic, I think that's something I become aware in working on those themes, is how we have a responsibility to our devices, to our cell towers. And working on that, I remember, made me begin something that I continue to do, which is whenever I see a cell tower, instead of turning away in disgust, I send the blessings. And, again, you can measure the effect. So I think it applies to everything that we create, to just everything that we are engaging with. So he speaks of the food, he speaks of the thought, those are really poles, and everything in between, everything. If we turn with, honoring and, yes, loving attentiveness into what we produce, what we create, and what we engage with, I think is the essence of that. So I'm not sure if that plugs into what you were wondering, Barbara.
No, that's you just added to, and of course enhanced it. Yeah, I mean, I actually imagine when Steiner writes, and he asks us if we are reading to the dead, that the reading has to be so rich with our understanding of what Steiner is writing there. And these to me are the gifts, the gifts that come from the spiritual world. And through our work to bring what it means to us, that activity is part of our gift giving back. And it's only that kind that our loved ones who we're reading to can get any understanding. It doesn't help them at all if we're just reading the words.
That's a wonderful point, and I think that just really is right on with all of this theme. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you consider that a sacrifice, Barbara? I mean, you don't have to read to the dead.
Yeah.
So is this a kind of sacrifice when it's done not in the sense of, I want you to continue to love me, so I'll read to you, but because I love you, I'm reading to you.
Yeah, I mean, when I look at Steiner's sacrifice and Christ's sacrifice,
Oh,
and the sacrifice of, of that building and all the hours of work that went in, yeah, I'd have to think if I can put my work on that level. It's a hard one.
Well, attention is sacrifice, isn't it? I mean, it's as close to God as we really get, or the love of God when we attend, because in order to do it, we have to sacrifice our attention to ourselves, basically,
Mhm.
attend to another.
Mhm.
well said, Pam. Yeah, this
And that sacrifice, it sounds like you're talking about the word will forces.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I completely agree with Andrew with regard to what you do there. I mean, it is a pure act and very
Mhm.
pure
Mhm.
act of will and penetrated with a really, feeling, understanding. Yeah.
Mhm. There we go, back to will and feeling.
There's
right.
also this element of impermanence and the desire for permanence. Like when I think about the Goetheanum burning, there's this expectation that we had that the building would, or they had, that the building would stand, and the sacrifice was a shift in mindset of what the building was serving. And you see that in, like, I've been to these 12-day Brahmin yajnas where they offer all of these ritualistically, all of these substances to the fire. And with them, there's the wisdom of the knowing that something so beautifully created, like flowers or clarified butter or all of these beautiful substances of earth, are made for that fire. So it's like a shift in our mindset of what our purpose is and what the purpose of the things that we take care of is. And I think it's very difficult for us to get there, to make peace with the change of the universe, the constant change. And that's like, that shift within ourselves in some ways is the sacrifice.
Yeah, I mean,
Mm.
Steiner says, flesh and spirit do not get along. Spirit is always consuming flesh, and its nature is that it will eventually get consumed. And yet we need that tension. We need to have form and be in time in order to have experience to grow. So we're sort of in this no-win situation where we want permanence, and yet permanence is exactly what we can't have and don't need. I mean, in the long run, we are living this sacrifice. Form will be consumed or flesh will be consumed in order for spirit to um, prevail and for us to become spirit. We have to die in order to live.
Is it a fire consuming the flesh
Uh, when you think about it, it probably is a combustion thing, but
from the spirit, right?
yeah,
Yeah,
spirit tends to
use
burn things
fire.
up. You know,
I am a consuming fire.
I am a consuming fire, exactly, and
Yeah.
I'm a consumable human being, so that sort of sets the dynamic.
Yes, yes. And it's interesting the word consuming because, I didn't mention it, but it's also, eating. It's consuming, it's burning, but it's so. And
Yeah.
it was said that in the mysteries, when people went candidate into mystery school, they were prepared to sacrifice. Sacrifice was the essential way to communicate with the gods. So you were entering sacrificial disciplines. Yeah.
It's also a sacrifice to come into the earth in this incarnation as well. I mean, that's a sacrifice to be here.
Such a sacrifice, Veronica. I really resonate with that, which is what you were saying too, Pam.
Yeah, just helps to acknowledge that process and how we're caught in a way.
It gets us back to Andrew's combustion of the carbon to create carbon dioxide so we can exhale. Thank you, Monique.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Monique. We should close. It's 8:31.
Okay,
So
that was
I wanna-
wonderful.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yes, it was wonderful.
Thank you for being there to share this. It was very meaningful for me.
Oh my goodness. So much work. Wow.
Exactly. So much work. I know how much can go in. So
Thank you
Monique,
for the sacrifice.
good to see
By
all
the
the
way, with reference to what you were saying, Barbara, there was something about realizing. It's not only, I have to sacrifice, but realizing the sacrifice you're making when you do that. I think there is something very significant in realizing that in ways that we don't realize. So
yeah, I'll work on that, realizing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, all. Bye-bye.